They were Hitler's elite bodyguard, the ruthless protectors of their Führer. But the Nazi regime's most loyal servants were also among the most feared gladiators of World War II. The Waffen-SS, the combat units of the SS, became famous for their tenacity on the battlefield. Countless times on both the Western and Eastern fronts, Waffen-SS men were the cornerstone of the German defenses, fighting to the death, even when all hope had gone. They were respected by their enemies for their fanatical courage, but feared for their barbarity. Survivors of the Waffen-SS insist that they were just soldiers doing their duty.
Es gingen wohl Gerüchte es gibt KZs und das war auch allgemein bekannt. Aber dass in den KZs so Furchtbares passierte unter dem Namen SS, aber das hat nichts mit der Waffen-SS zu tun. Wir waren Soldaten, ganz einfache Soldaten.
Many of the evil crimes which made the name of the SS notorious were indeed carried out by other parts of the organization. The Gestapo, the concentration camp guards, and the extermination squads. But what cannot be denied is that the Waffen-SS was responsible for some of the most appalling atrocities of the war. One of the most notorious was the utter destruction of the French village of Oradour and the massacre of 648 of its inhabitants in June 1944. Yet even today, the veterans refuse to accept that such things happened.
Ich weiß aus meiner Dienstzeit, und ich war den gesamten Krieg über bei der Waffen-SS, ich weiß von keinem Kriegsverbrechen.
Who were these men capable of such extraordinary acts of both heroism and barbarity? The origins of this elite World War II fighting force lie in the early days of the Nazi Party in the 1920s. Germany was paying the price for its defeat in 1918. The democratic Weimar Republic was grappling with the effects of the harsh peace terms imposed by the victorious Allies. The payment of massive war reparations had crippled Germany and resulted in runaway inflation and widespread unemployment. People moved towards the political extremes, the communists on the one hand and Adolf Hitler's Nazis on the other. Clashes became frequent. In 1922, the Nazis formed the Sturmabteilung, the Storm Unit, or SA, to protect its speakers at rallies. They quickly became known as the Brown Shirts from the color of their uniform. The following year, Ernst Röhm, the SA leader, formed a special unit to protect Hitler himself. This was recognizable by the black caps worn by its members. Gradually, it became independent of the Brown Shirts, taking the title Schutzstaffel, the Protection Squad, or SS, and adopting a wholly black uniform. In 1929, the mild-seeming but ruthless Heinrich Himmler, one of Hitler's closest cronies, became head of the SS. This was still small in size compared to the Brown Shirts, which now numbered over 60,000 men. Himmler stressed the differences between the SS and the SA. He saw the latter as a mass paramilitary force, whereas the SS was an elite and integral part of the Nazi Party. Himmler began to increase the SS's power base by taking over the Nazi Party's departments for intelligence and racial affairs. Soon after Hitler became Chancellor of Germany in January 1933, the SS gained very significant new roles. It provided the guards for the newly established concentration camp at Dachau in the suburbs of Munich. Eventually, this was to lead to its infamous role as the main perpetrator of the extermination of the Jews. In 1936, the SS also took over the Gestapo, the secret state police which had been founded in 1933 by Hermann Göring. This meant that Himmler now had all the organs of political policing and terror under his direct control. Alongside these developments, the new Führer also ordered the formation of a special SS unit which was to be called the SS Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler. This would eventually grow into the Waffen, or armed SS. The Leibstandarte was to be Hitler's personal household guard, on duty at the Reichschancellery and at the Führer's mountain retreat at Berchtesgaden in the Bavarian Alps. Sepp Dietrich, a bluff and outspoken World War I sergeant major who had since become part of Hitler's inner circle, was appointed to command the Leibstandarte. Its members were all volunteers, and Dietrich insisted they must be mature men of 23 to 35, in superb physical condition and at least 5 foot 11 inches tall. Applicants also had to prove that they were of pure Aryan ancestry, with no hint of Jewish blood. In keeping with Himmler's belief that the SS were an elite within the Nazi Party, the Waffen-SS recruits were indoctrinated with Nazi ideology and the belief that they were members of a master race. This was the core of the ruthlessness which the Waffen-SS were to display on the battlefield. They were housed in Berlin's Lichterfelder barracks, which under the Kaiser had been one of Germany's leading officer cadet schools. Military training was largely provided by the army. Physical fitness and field exercises played a large part. But the Leibstandarte prided itself on its turnout and drill. Other units of the SS soon jeeringly referred to its members as the asphalt soldiers. Despite the growth of the SS, the SA remained a powerful force in Germany. Ernst Röhm even advocated that Hitler give his brown shirts primacy over the armed forces in the defense of the Reich. Hitler decided that Röhm was becoming a threat. Early on the 30th of June 1934, he flew to Munich. He was accompanied by Sepp Dietrich and a selected unit of the Leibstandarte. Hitler went on to arrest Röhm and several of his cronies at a lakeside resort, while Dietrich carried out further arrests in Munich itself. Others were arrested in Berlin, and the Leibstandarte carried out many of the subsequent executions. As Himmler's adjutant, SS General Karl Wolff later explained, friendship and personal loyalty were not allowed to stand in its way.
Among others, a charming fellow, Count von Spreti, Röhm's personal adjutant. He held the same position with Röhm as I held with Himmler, died with the words Heil Hitler on his lips. We were close personal friends. We often dined together in Berlin. He lifted his arm in the Nazi salute and called out, Heil Hitler, I love Germany.
The Leibstandarte's ruthlessness and total loyalty to Hitler were now proven. Its reward would not be long in coming. The loyalty of the SS Leibstandarte, when Röhm's brown shirts were decimated, was rewarded by Hitler with a major expansion. Sepp Dietrich's Leibstandarte became a full regiment, and 2 more were formed. These were to be known as the SS Verfügungstruppe, or SSVT, special purpose troops who would be completely distinct from the other branches of the SS. The expansion of the armed branch of the SS did not lead to any reduction in the physical or racial standards demanded. The SSVT remained Hitler's elite political troops, indoctrinated with the belief in their superiority. Almost inevitably, the expansion incurred the hostility of the army, which suspected that Hitler was creating a rival military force. His actual intention was that in time of war, the SSVT would be incorporated into the army as a complete division. The army resisted this, refusing to provide the SSVT with the necessary artillery and other support for it to function as a division. The generals pleaded that Hitler's demands for rapid expansion of his army meant that they could not spare the resources. Nevertheless, the army did help the SSVT with its training. It also allowed the transfer of certain officers to improve the SSVT's military efficiency. The highly experienced Paul Hauser became head of the Waffen-SS Inspectorate. Felix Steiner, the Army's Director of Education, took a similar role for the Waffen-SS. He had been a stormtrooper during World War I and saw the Waffen-SS adopting a similar role as highly trained assault troops. They would lead attacks, with the army providing the follow-up cannon fodder. The aim was to create a force of men who would be tough and ruthless. As events would show, Hauser and Steiner succeeded brilliantly. But the downside was that the men of the Waffen-SS became totally careless about human life, whether their own or the enemy's. The seeds had been sown for the atrocities which were to sully the reputation of the Waffen-SS. In spite of the army's suspicion of the SSVT, it was given control of the Leibstandarte during the annexation of Austria in March 1938, and of other SSVT units during the seizure of the Sudetenland province of Czechoslovakia that autumn. The failure of Britain and France to intervene when he dismembered what was left of Czechoslovakia convinced Hitler that it was now safe to turn on Poland. The SSVT was about to have its first real taste of combat. The SSVT fought in the Polish campaign as separate motorized infantry regiments. Hitler took particular interest in the progress of Sepp Dietrich and the Leibstandarte, daily marking Sepp on his map in the Chancellery. Yet in spite of the lightning German victory over Poland, the army felt that the performance of the SSVT left much to be desired. Its units lacked fire discipline and were careless with casualties. It also showed an ominous tendency to torch villages and brutalize civilians. In defense of his men, Himmler argued that they would have performed much better if they had been concentrated in one formation rather than fighting under senior army commanders whom they did not know. Hitler agreed to allow further expansion, but insisted that the new units must remain under the operational control of the army. While the Leibstandarte remained an independent regiment, the others were combined into a separate division. A second division was created by volunteers from the police, and a third from the units originally created to guard the Nazi concentration camps. This was known as the SS Totenkopf, or Death's Head Division. Its commander, Theodor Eicke, had been the commandant of Dachau and was notorious for his brutality. The enlarged SSVT was also given a new title. In March 1940, it became the Waffen, or Armed SS, confirming it as a separate element of Germany's armed forces. On the 10th of May 1940, Hitler launched his long-expected attack on the West. The SS Leibstandarte and a second SS regiment helped to spearhead the invasion of Holland. Simultaneously, airborne forces were dropped to capture Dutch airfields. In the 5-day campaign that followed, the Leibstandarte linked up with the airborne forces after a number of clashes with Dutch troops. There was, however, an unfortunate incident in Rotterdam when the airborne commander, General Kertstudent, was wounded. He suspected that it had been a trigger-happy SS man, although the Leibstandarte strenuously denied it. The Waffen-SS did not take part in the thrust by the panzers through the wooded Ardennes and across the River Meuse. But as they began to rampage westwards, the SS Totenkopf division was summoned from the reserve to fight in support of Erwin Rommel's 7th Panzer Division. On the 21st of May, the British launched an armoured counterstroke into the flank of 7th Panzer and the SS Totenkopf. They succeeded in knocking the Germans off balance momentarily and caused some panic, especially in the ranks of the Totenkopf, before the advance westwards continued. The Germans now trapped the British, together with French troops, in a pocket based on the port of Dunkirk. The SS Leibstandarte joined in the fighting to reduce the perimeter. It met stiff British resistance, especially from the village of Wormhout. Dietrich himself was shot up in his car and had to spend some time under fire in a ditch. Not until almost nightfall was the village secured. The Leibstandarte captured a number of British soldiers. Some 90 of them were herded into a barn. One of the few survivors describes what happened next.
Started taking us out in fives. I was in the second five, and we had to turn the backs to them. And because I got shot there, when I come to, I would crawl back into the barn. The Germans came back and they started all over again, and the boys behind me, they fell over, they got blown over on top of me, and by luck, I only got hit in the knee.
It was one of the first documented examples of the behavior for which the Waffen-SS was to become notorious. Theodor Eicher's Totenkopf was also guilty of massacring prisoners, this time at a village called Le Paradis, when they murdered almost 100 British soldiers. To celebrate his victory in the West, Hitler made a triumphant speech in Berlin's Kroll Opera House on the 19th of July. He singled out the Waffen-SS for special praise. Its tactical performance had improved, but blind obedience and ideological brainwashing made Waffen-SS soldiers careless with their lives and frighteningly ready to murder prisoners. Following the campaign in the West, Himmler was keen to expand the Waffen-SS, but the army was concerned that he was stealing recruits. Hitler therefore authorized only a small expansion, but did allow one significant change. A new division, the SS Viking, was formed from the citizens of German-occupied countries inhabited by people of related stock, as Himmler put it. A number of right-wing Danish, Dutch and Norwegians volunteered to join the SS Viking division. One Dane later gave his reason for enlisting in the Waffen-SS.
I was fighting voluntarily in the Waffen-SS on the East Front for the idea of Europe united. And what I would like to emphasize is that Germany, we had the only opportunity we had to fight the communism. We couldn't do it alone. We could do it together with Germany.
In the meantime, the SS Das Reich division and the Leibstandarte took part in the invasion of Yugoslavia and Greece in April 1941. The campaign saw both units distinguish themselves, and one particular action typified the best aspects of the fighting spirit of the Waffen-SS and its determination to prove itself better than the army. Hauptsturmführer Walter Klingenberg, a company commander of the Das Reich, led his men in a race to reach the Yugoslav capital Belgrade before the army's crack Großdeutschland regiment. Although severely hampered by the spring rains which had turned the roads into quagmires, his unit reached the banks of the Danube first. But it was unable to cross because all the bridges had been destroyed. Klingenberg found a single rowing boat, which had been abandoned, and crossed the river with 10 volunteers. They headed for the German embassy, which was besieged by an angry crowd. Klingenberg used the embassy phone to telephone Belgrade's mayor. He then threatened to call in an airstrike unless the city surrendered. Unaware that the Germans had no radio, the mayor fell for the bluff and gave in. Klingenberg received the Knight's Cross for his achievement. He was to fight on in the Waffen-SS, dying in April 1945, only days before Germany surrendered. When the Germans reached Greece's capital, Athens, it was Sepp Dietrich who took the surrender of the Greek army. Once again, one of the Führer's favorite soldiers had proved a hero, and the Waffen-SS had added to its growing reputation for élan and aggressiveness. The campaign in the Balkans was, however, a mere sideshow compared to the storm that Hitler was about to unleash. On the 22nd of June 1941, he launched Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of Soviet Russia. By now, the Leibstandarte had been expanded to a fully fledged division in its own right, and all 6 existing Waffen-SS divisions took part in the initial assault. It was now that ideology came into play. The men of the Waffen-SS were imbued with the belief that the Russians were subhuman and that they were embarking on a crusade to save Western civilization. This gave the Waffen-SS a new, ruthless determination to achieve victory at whatever cost. The army generals soon came to respect its fighting qualities in a war that was more savage than any so far experienced. But the reputation of the Waffen-SS was soon being linked to the activities of other SS units, in particular the Einsatzgruppen, or extermination squads, which organized massacres of thousands of Soviet Jews. What was seen as a crusade against communism encouraged further volunteers from both occupied Eastern and Western Europe to enlist in the Waffen-SS. They became known as the Foreign Legions of the SS, and were often amongst the most ruthless members of the Waffen-SS. Typical of the men who came forward was the Belgian Léon de Grelle, who had been a leader of the extreme right-wing Rexist party before the war. He raised the Walloon, or Flanders Legion, which was incorporated in the Waffen-SS. De Grelle took it to Russia and led it in combat. Hitler personally decorated him with the Knight's Cross and is reputed to have said, "If I had had a son, I would have liked him to be like you." The Waffen-SS proved itself during the grim battles of winter 1941-42 through its ability to stand and fight. That spring, 3 divisions, Leibstandarte, Totenkopf and Das Reich, were withdrawn to the west to refit and be converted to Panzer Grenadier divisions through the addition of tanks. Formed into the SS Panzer Corps, Himmler ensured that these divisions received the best equipment and were larger than the equivalent army divisions. The SS Panzer Corps, commanded by Paul Hauser, returned to Russia in early 1943 and won undying fame for its recapture of Kharkov that spring. Sepp Dietrich, in particular, distinguished himself. Hitler awarded him the swords to his Knight's Cross and gave him a gift of 1 million marks. By now, the Waffen-SS had become a formidable fighting force, notorious for its willingness to fight to the death. Army commanders employed it as their fire brigade. They sent its divisions to the most critical points on the battlefield with every confidence that the SS soldiers would tip the scales. While unquestioning obedience remained the cornerstone of the Waffen-SS, relations between officers and men were less formal than in the army, with much more emphasis on mutual respect. But the ruthlessness that characterized Hitler's ideological soldiers became increasingly apparent. They gave little quarter in the ever more bitter battles on the Eastern Front. In turn, the men of the Waffen-SS knew that they could expect little mercy if captured by the Russians. This increased their resolve never to surrender as the carnage continued. No Waffen-SS units were involved in the disaster at Stalingrad in early 1943, when an entire German army was surrounded and forced to surrender. But it was to be heavily involved in the crucial battle which finally confirmed that the tide of war on the Eastern Front had turned. In July 1943, the Germans launched a major offensive designed to pinch out the massive Kursk salient. The Waffen-SS had been expanded to 4 corps, some 12 divisions, and most of these took part in what was to become one of the largest and most bitter tank battles in history. After a week's fighting against ever tougher Russian resistance, Hitler was obliged to halt the attack. Thereafter, the Germans were forced onto the defensive as the Red Army steamroller began the liberation of Western Russia. The SS divisions again became the cornerstone of the German defense. Time and again, they counterattacked and broke out of encirclements as the Russian offensives drove ever further west. But Hitler was increasingly aware that the Allies were posing a growing threat to Germany in the west. Italy had been invaded, and Anglo-American forces were building up in Britain. An Allied landing in France was inevitable, and it would soon present the Waffen-SS with fresh challenges. In the spring of 1944, the German forces in France and the Low Countries stood waiting for the Anglo-American assault. Behind the coastal guns and beach obstacles of Hitler's much vaunted Atlantic Wall and the infantry divisions that supported it were deployed 11 Panzer and Panzer Grenadier divisions. Four of these formations were Waffen-SS divisions. In southern France was the Das Reich, and in the Loire Valley, 17th SS Panzer Grenadier Division. The Leibstandarte was in Belgium, refitting after bitter fighting on the Eastern Front, and west of Paris, the recently formed 12th SS Panzer Division Hitler Jugend. As its name suggests, the Hitler Youth Division consisted of 17 and 18-year-old members of the Hitler Youth, stiffened by combat-experienced officers and NCOs. The recruits of the Hitler Jugend Division were the generation of boys who had been educated wholly under Nazi rule. Indoctrinated since earliest youth with the ideology of survival of the fittest and war as the noblest activity of mankind, they were to be among the most fanatical of all Hitler's political soldiers. Sepp Dietrich's 1st SS Panzer Corps commanded 3 of the 4 divisions. When the Allies did land in Normandy on D-Day, the 6th of June, only one Panzer division was close to the beaches, but its units were too scattered for it to be able to contest the initial landings. Hitler refused to allow the bulk of the panzer divisions to be moved without his permission. The Führer slept late, and no one dared wake him, so it was not until the afternoon that the Hitler Jugend began to deploy. Its troops began to come into action on the evening of D+1. But rather than being able to mount a decisive counterattack to drive the Allies back into the sea, the Hitler Youth found themselves fighting a desperate defensive battle. By the 13th of June, the British appeared poised to break through the German line in the area of the village of Villers-Bocage. It was then that SS Lieutenant Michael Wittmann, who had already won the Knight's Cross in Russia, performed a feat which became a legend of the fighting style of the Waffen-SS. He was supervising some much-needed maintenance on his 5 Tiger tanks in a wood when he spotted a column of British vehicles travelling along the road running up the hill from Villers-Bocage. Realizing that they had halted, Wittmann jumped into his tank and charged down the column, firing as he went. Within a matter of a few minutes, he had knocked out 25 British vehicles. Wittmann charged on into the village, and only then was his Tiger disabled by a British Cromwell tank, firing at almost point-blank range. Wittmann and his crew managed to escape. Their action single-handedly brought the British attack to a halt. In the meantime, the Hitler Youth became involved in the tenacious defense of the city of Caen. Time and again, they frustrated British and Canadian efforts to break through. Fritz Witt, their inspirational commander, was killed early in the battle. His place was taken by Kurt Meyer, a founder member of the Leibstandarte, who was known as Panzer Meyer because of his dashing exploits in Greece and Russia. In spite of their dwindling strength, Meyer and his young soldiers fought on, gaining high respect from friend and foe alike. But if the Waffen-SS divisions fought bravely in Normandy, they also displayed the same ruthlessness as in Russia. On at least 2 occasions, captured Canadian soldiers were shot in cold blood. The SS Das Reich Panzer Division committed an even worse atrocity during its move to Normandy from the south of France. It was forced to travel by road because of the Allied destruction of the rail system. The French resistance constantly harried the Germans, blowing bridges and mounting ambushes. Finally, in the village of Oradour-sur-Glane, the Das Reich wreaked a terrible revenge. The Waffen-SS troops rounded up the villages and set their houses alight. Then they herded them into the church and torched this as well. A total of 648 French civilians were slaughtered in this atrocity. For many, Oradour was the defining moment when the claim that the Waffen-SS were simply combat soldiers was exposed as a myth. Despite their claims after the war that they were never involved in atrocities, the gaunt ruins of this French village still prove otherwise. Even though a further SS Panzer Corps reached Normandy, the Germans did eventually buckle under the remorseless Allied pressure. The shattered remnants of their army withdrew eastwards across France. By that time, many of the leading Waffen-SS commanders had become casualties. Panzer Meyer had been wounded and captured. Michael Wittmann, the hero of Villers-Bocage, was dead. Only overstretched Allied supply lines prevented the German retreat from becoming a rout. By the end of the first week of September, the Allied advance had come to a virtual halt. The Waffen-SS divisions were withdrawn from the line to refit. Two of them, the 9th and 10th SS Panzer Divisions, did so in the Arnhem region of Holland. This was to prove disastrous for the Allies. For on the 17th of September 1944, they mounted a massive airborne operation to outflank Germany's last natural bastion in the west, the River Rhine, by seizing bridges over the Dutch waterways. British and Polish paratroops dropped at Arnhem. The Waffen-SS troops went quickly into action. During the bitter, week-long struggle that followed, they gradually tightened their grip on the embattled paratroops, eventually forcing them to surrender. But by now, Hitler was preparing his own audacious gamble against the Western Allies. This was a massive counter-offensive in the west through the Ardennes region of Belgium and designed to split the British from the Americans. Spearheading the attack would be two panzer armies, one of them commanded by Sepp Dietrich, which consisted largely of Waffen-SS divisions. The offensive opened on the 16th of December, 1944. Dietrich's battle groups sliced through the American defenses, spreading panic and confusion. But the hilly and wooded Ardennes was very much harder going in December 1944 than it had been in May 1940. After the first few days, the weather cleared, and Allied air power began to wreak havoc. In increasingly difficult conditions, the German advance slowed, and one battle group after another ground to a halt. It was now that the worst side of the Waffen-SS again became apparent. Joachim Peiper, one of its most fanatical and aggressive young officers, was commanding the battle group which advanced furthest west. It left a trail of atrocities in its wake. Peiper's men murdered unarmed Belgian civilians. Near the village of Malmedy, they ambushed a US artillery observation battalion, which thought that it was well inside friendly territory. Ruthlessly picking off the vehicles at the beginning and end of the convoy so as to trap the remainder, Peiper's men ensured that few of them escaped the carnage that followed. Many of those Americans made prisoner were marched into a field and shot in cold blood. It was an atrocity which would come back to haunt the Waffen-SS. But despite their barbarity, by the end of December, Hitler's armies were in retreat. His final gamble in the West had failed, and he was forced to turn once more to the east, where the Red Army was poised to advance onto German soil. The final act of the drama of the Waffen-SS and the regime they served so loyally was about to be played out. As 1945 began, the Red Army prepared for the assault, which would take it into the Nazi Reich. Hitler ordered Sepp Dietrich to move his army to Hungary to lead an offensive to recapture the oil fields near Lake Balaton. Dietrich's command was renamed 6th SS Panzer Army. Himmler's ambition for the Waffen-SS to fight under its own command had at last been realized. The final German offensive in the east took place in early March 1945. Dietrich's SS Panzer Army and the German 6th Army, which was also taking part, struggled forward in the snow and mud against increasing Russian resistance. Within a week, the attack had ground to a halt. So angry was Hitler that he ordered the SS men to remove their prized divisional cuff bands as a mark of disgrace. But true to their motto, "My honor is my loyalty," the Waffen-SS divisions continued to fight on as the Russians and Western allies squeezed the Third Reich ever tighter. By now, on both the eastern and western fronts, the true horror of the activities of other branches of the SS was becoming clear, as the extermination camps were overrun. Horrified Allied troops made little attempt to differentiate between the guilt of those who wore the SS badge. In the West, the Allies continually came up against small pockets of fanatical SS resistance, but this could only delay the inevitable. In the East, the remnants of the 6th SS Panzer Army could not prevent the Russians from capturing Vienna. There remained the final prize, Berlin. The Russian assault on the German capital began on the 16th of April. Within a week, fighting was taking place in the city itself. Among the elements defending Berlin were French and Latvian SS troops. Hitler still hoped that his Waffen-SS could weave a miracle and rescue him, but he was now living in total fantasy. The German garrison finally surrendered on the 2nd of May, 2 days after Hitler had taken his own life. Fearing that they would receive little mercy from the Russians, there was now a rush among the surviving SS and army formations to surrender to the Western Allies. A number of SS divisions conducted formal surrender parades to demonstrate their defiance. Because of the vast catalogue of crimes against humanity committed by the SS as a whole, and the war crimes of particular units of the Waffen-SS, all SS men were rounded up for special interrogation. Many tried to disguise themselves, but the giveaway was their SS number tattooed under the arm, which could not be easily hidden. Some Waffen-SS men eventually found themselves on trial, and some paid the ultimate price for their crimes. Very few of those who fell into Russian hands were ever to get back to Germany. For the Waffen-SS, the trial of the men involved in the Malmedy massacre was the most notorious. Almost everyone in the Waffen-SS chain of command was arraigned, and the vast majority found guilty. Sepp Dietrich, under whose ultimate command Piper had been, was among the first to be sentenced.
At the time the vote was taken concurring, sentences you to life imprisonment, commencing forthwith at such places may be designated by competent military authority.
Joachim Piper, whose battle group had been responsible for the massacre, was one of 6 men sentenced to death. The death sentences were eventually commuted, and Dietrich himself was released on parole in 1955, but the long arm of justice had not yet finished with him. 2 years later, he was arraigned by a West German court for his part in the Night of the Long Knives in 1934. He was sentenced to a further term in jail, but was released after 15 months on medical grounds. For him, and for many of those who fought under him, the brutal reality of what had been done was soon glossed over.
Ich muss dazu sagen, dass wir eine Fronttruppe sind. Wir sind nur vorne gewesen, wir haben gekämpft. Was im Hinterland passiert ist, davon wissen wir nichts.
Waren Soldaten, ganz einfache Soldaten.
Despite all the evidence to the contrary, it appears that the West German government agreed. During the 1950s, it awarded the Waffen-SS veterans war pensions on the grounds that they had fought for their country in the same way as every other soldier. The authorities also allowed those who fought in the Waffen-SS to form their own association, Hayag, which continues to this day. This was in stark contrast to the treatment of men like Leon de Grelle, who had fought in the foreign legions of the Waffen-SS. He could never return to Belgium, where he was regarded as a traitor, and lived out the rest of his long life in Spain. Sepp Dietrich, the personification of Hitler's political soldiers, died in his bed in April 1966. He was buried with the honors befitting one who had fought with gallantry and distinction for his country. Dietrich and his comrades in the Waffen-SS developed a combat reputation second to none. Their determination to fight on, often against impossible odds, gained the respect of their enemies and the admiration of their countrymen. They were true gladiators. But poisoned by its ideology, their tragedy was that they became the willing servants of an evil regime. Their reputation as fighting soldiers will be forever sullied by the atrocities which they committed in its name.